something profoundly unsettling about silence. Not the kind of silence that exists in a room when everyone has left, but the kind that exists when you're forced to sit with yourself. No distractions, no noise, no phones, no people, just you and the raw, unfiltered truth of who you are. Most people would do anything to avoid this moment. They'll scroll endlessly through their phones. They'll turn on the television to fill the void. They'll surround themselves with people they don't even particularly like, just to escape the uncomfortable reality of being alone with their own thoughts. And I understand why. Because when you are truly alone, when there's nothing left to distract you, you come face to face with questions you've been running from your entire life. Who am I really? What have I become? Am I living the life I was designed to live? Or am I simply existing, moving from one day to the next without purpose, without direction, without the courage to confront the person I see in the mirror? There was a man I heard about several years ago, a successful entrepreneur, wealthy by every standard, respected in his community, married with children. From the outside, his life looked like the perfect picture of achievement. But one day, during a business trip, he found himself alone in a hotel room in a foreign city. His meetings had ended early. His phone had no signal. And for the first time in perhaps decades, he had nothing to do, nowhere to be, no one to impress. He sat on the edge of that hotel bed and something unexpected happened. He began to weep. Not because of sadness, not because of loss, but because in that moment of forced solitude, he realized he didn't know himself anymore. He had spent so many years performing, pleasing others, building an image that he had lost touch with the core of who he was. He couldn't remember the last time he had asked himself what he truly wanted, what brought him genuine joy, what his authentic voice even sounded like. Beneath all the layers of pretense, that hotel room became a turning point. Not because anything dramatic happened, but because he finally stopped running. He sat in that silence, uncomfortable as it was, and began the painful but necessary work of reacquainting himself with himself. This is the journey I want to talk to you about today. Not a journey to some distant place, but a journey inward, the most challenging expedition you will ever undertake. We live in a generation that is terrified of solitude. We've built entire industries around distraction. Social media platforms designed to keep you scrolling, streaming services offering endless content, dating apps that promise you never have to be alone, productivity culture that glorifies being busy to the point of exhaustion. All of it serves one purpose: to keep you from sitting still long enough to hear the whispers of your own soul. But here's what they don't tell you. Your greatest growth, your deepest transformation, your most profound revelations about life and purpose, they don't happen in the noise. They happen in the silence. They happen when you are alone, stripped of all external validation, forced to reckon with the truth of your existence. Learning to be alone with yourself is not about becoming antisocial or withdrawing from the world. It's about developing such a strong sense of self that you no longer need constant external affirmation to know who you are. It's about building an internal compass so reliable that you can navigate life's storms without constantly looking to others for direction. Think about the great figures throughout history who changed the world. Before they could lead others, they first had to find themselves in solitude. Moses spent 40 years in the wilderness before he was ready to lead a nation. Buddha sat under a tree for weeks in deep meditation before achieving enlightenment. Nelson Mandela spent 27 years in a prison cell, much of it in solitary confinement, and emerged not broken but refined with a clarity of vision that would transform a nation. These weren't just random periods of isolation. They were crucibles of transformation. In the furnace of solitude, everything falls, burns away. Every mask you wear, every role you play, every version of yourself you've constructed to please others, it all melts away until you're left with the raw material of who you truly are. And yes, that process is uncomfortable. It's supposed to be, because you've been carrying so much that isn't yours. You've been living under the weight of other people's expectations, other people's definitions of success, other people's opinions about who you should be and what you should do with your life. And when you're finally alone, truly alone, you begin to feel the weight of all that baggage. You begin to see how much of your life has been spent trying to be someone you're not. I remember hearing about a woman who had spent her entire career as a lawyer. It was what her parents wanted, what society respected, what provided financial security. She was good at it, successful even. But one summer, she took a solo trip to a remote cabin in the mountains. No internet, no phone service, just her and nature for 2 weeks. The first 3 days were torture. She didn't know what to do with herself. She tried to read, tried to write, tried to hike, but nothing could quiet the restlessness inside her. She kept reaching for her phone, forgetting it had no service. She kept making mental notes to email people, to check on cases, to maintain the persona of the busy, important lawyer. But by the 4th day, something shifted. The silence stopped feeling like an enemy and started feeling like a friend. She began to notice things, the sound of birds she'd never paid attention to, the way light filtered through the trees, the rhythm of her own breathing. And in that noticing, in that stillness, a question emerged from somewhere deep within. If you could do anything with your life, what would you do? The answer came immediately without hesitation. She would teach. She would walk with young people, help them discover their potential, guide them through the confusion of adolescence. This wasn't a new dream. It was her original dream, the one she'd had before. The world told her what was practical, what was sensible, what would make her parents proud. She returned from that trip and within a year had completely transformed her life. Not recklessly. She planned, she prepared, she made the transition thoughtfully. But the clarity she needed, the courage she required, the conviction that this was right, all of it came from those 2 weeks of learning to be alone with herself. This is the power of solitude. It strips away the superficial and reveals the essential. It forces you to confront the gap between the life you're living and the life you were meant to live. And yes, that confrontation can be painful, but it's a necessary pain. The kind of pain that precedes healing, like setting a broken bone. Most people avoid this pain by staying perpetually busy. They fill every moment with activity, every silence with noise. They can't sit through a meal without their phone, can't drive without the radio, can't go to bed without the television. And they'll tell you it's because they're productive, because they're social, because they're engaged with life. But the truth is they're running. They are running from themselves. Because being alone with yourself means facing things you've been avoiding. It means acknowledging the ways you've compromised your values. It means recognizing the relationships you've stayed in too long, the careers you've pursued for the wrong reasons, the dreams you've abandoned because they seemed impractical. It means looking at your life honestly and admitting that perhaps, just perhaps, you've been living someone else's script instead of writing your own. And that's terrifying. Because once you see it, you can't unsee it. Once you acknowledge the truth, you become responsible for it. You can't go back to sleepwalking through life. You can't pretend anymore that everything is fine when deep down you know it isn't. But here's what's on the other side of that terror. Freedom. Real, authentic, unshakable freedom. The freedom that comes from knowing yourself so well that no one can tell you who you are. The freedom that comes from building your life on the foundation of your own truth rather than other people's expectations. The freedom that comes from being so grounded in your authentic self that criticism doesn't destroy you and praise doesn't define you. This freedom doesn't come cheap. It requires you to do something most people never do. Spend substantial time alone in silence doing the deep work of self-examination. Not once, not occasionally, but as a regular practice, a discipline, a commitment to your own growth and self-awareness. In practical terms, this might mean setting aside time each day to sit in silence, no phone, no music, no distractions, and simply be present with yourself. It might mean taking regular solo retreats, even if just for a day or a weekend, to disconnect from the world and reconnect with yourself. It might mean starting a journal where you can explore your thoughts and feelings without censoring yourself, without worrying about what anyone else might think. But whatever form it takes, it must be intentional, because left to our default settings, we'll always choose distraction over introspection, noise over silence, external validation over internal knowing. There's a story I once heard about a young man who felt completely lost in life. He was in his mid-20s, had graduated from university, started a career, but felt a profound sense of emptiness. Nothing he did seemed to matter. Nothing brought him lasting satisfaction. He was going through the motions but felt dead inside. One day, a mentor told him something that changed everything. You don't have a problem with your life. You have a problem with yourself. And until you figure out who you are, you keep trying to fill that void with external things. Relationships, achievements, possessions, and none of it will work because the problem is internal. The young man was offended at first. He thought the mentor was being harsh, maybe even cruel, but the words haunted him. They kept echoing in his mind, especially during quiet moments he couldn't escape. Finally, he decided to do something radical. He took a leave of absence from his job and spent 3 months living in a small cottage by the sea. He had enough savings to survive, and he committed to spending those 3 months alone with minimal external contact. No social media, no dating, no endless phone calls to friends. Just him, his thoughts, and the ocean. The first month was hell. He was bored, restless, anxious. He questioned his decision constantly. He wondered if he was wasting time, falling behind his peers, making a terrible mistake. His mind raced with worries and doubts and fears, but he stayed with it. He sat with the discomfort. He walked the beach for hours, wrote in his journal, read books that challenged him, asked himself hard questions, and refused to settle for easy answers. By the second month, something began to shift. The noise in his head started to quiet. He began to notice patterns in his thinking, beliefs he'd held his entire life without ever examining them. He realized how much of his identity had been borrowed from others, his parents' values, his friends' opinions, society's definitions of success. And in that realization, space opened up, space to ask, what do I actually believe? What do I actually value? What kind of life do I actually want to live? By the 3rd month, he had found something precious. Clarity. Not all the answers. He was wise enough to know that life doesn't work that way. But a clear sense of direction. A strong internal compass. A foundation of self-knowledge that would guide him through whatever came next. When he returned to his life, everything looked different. Not because the world had changed, but because he had changed. He had learned to be alone with himself, and in doing so, he had discovered who he truly was beneath all the layers of conditioning and expectation. He made different choices after that. Some relationships ended because they were based on the person he'd been pretending to be. His career path shifted because he was no longer chasing other people's definitions of success. His entire life reorganized itself around this new center of gravity. He discovered his authentic self. And here's the beautiful thing. When you know yourself, when you're grounded in your own truth, you become more capable of genuine connection with others. Not the superficial connections based on shared interests or mutual benefit, but deep, authentic relationships where you can show up as your real self. This is the paradox. Learning to be alone with yourself doesn't make you a hermit. It makes you more fully human, more capable of real intimacy, more present in your relationships because you're no longer using them to escape yourself. When you haven't done this work, when you haven't learned to be comfortable in your own company, you bring a desperate energy to every relationship. You need people to complete you, to validate you, to tell you you're okay. And that neediness, that desperation, people can feel it. It repels genuine connection even as you are desperately seeking it. But when you've sat in the fire of solitude and emerged, knowing who you are, you bring something entirely different to your relationships. You bring wholeness. You bring presence. You bring the ability to love others without needing them to fill the void inside you, because there is no void. You found yourself, and that changes everything. Let me tell you about something I learned from observing people who've mastered this art of being alone with themselves. They have a quality that's hard to define but impossible to miss. They are calm in chaos. They're centered when everyone around them is spinning. They don't get swept up in every trend, every opinion, every drama. They have an anchor, an internal reference point that keeps them steady. I once knew of a man who worked in a high-pressure corporate environment. Deadlines, politics, constant demands. It was relentless. His colleagues were burning out left and right, stressed, anxious, medicated just to cope with the pressure. But this man seemed untouched by it all. Not because he didn't care or wasn't working hard, but because he had something they didn't have. Every morning, without fail, he would wake up 2 hours before he needed to leave for work. Not to get ahead on tasks or check emails. Those 2 hours were sacred. He would sit in complete silence for 30 minutes, just being present with himself. No meditation app, no guided visualization, just silence. Then he would write in his journal stream of consciousness, whatever came up, no censoring. Then he would move his body, sometimes yoga, sometimes just walking, sometimes dancing to music no one else could hear. His colleagues thought he was eccentric. They couldn't understand why anyone would wake up that early when they didn't have to. They were hitting snooze 3 times and rushing out the door with coffee in hand, already stressed before the day even began. But this man knew something they didn't. He knew that the quality of his external life was determined by the quality of his internal life. He knew that if he didn't take time to center himself, to connect with himself, to ground himself in his own being, the world would toss him around like a leaf in a storm. And so while his colleagues were reactive, responding to every email like it was an emergency, getting triggered by every criticism, seeking validation from their bosses, he was responsive. He could pause, consider, choose his response rather than being driven by unconscious patterns and fears. This is what being alone with yourself cultivates. The ability to respond rather than react. To choose rather than be chosen for. To live intentionally rather than by default. But I need to be honest with you about something. This journey isn't just uncomfortable at the beginning. It remains challenging because what you discover about yourself isn't always flattering. When you strip away all the distractions and really look at yourself, you see things you've been hiding from. You see your selfishness, your pettiness, your jealousy, your pride. You see the ways you've hurt people, the opportunities you've squandered, the potential you've left unrealized. There's a woman I heard about who started a practice of spending 1 hour each evening in complete solitude. No phone, no TV, no books, nothing. Just sitting with herself. After a few weeks of this practice, she had a breakdown. Not because anything external had happened, but because she finally had to face something she'd been running from for years. She realized she had built her entire adult life around proving something to her father, a man who had been critical and withholding of affection her whole childhood. Every achievement, every relationship, every choice had been made with this unconscious question. Will this finally make him proud? Will this finally earn his approval? And in that moment of recognition, sitting alone in her living room, she wept. She wept for all the years she'd wasted trying to earn something that was never going to be given. She wept for the authentic life she hadn't lived because she'd been too busy performing for an audience of one who would never applaud. But here's what's beautiful about that moment. It was the beginning of her freedom. Because once you see the pattern, once you drag it out of the unconscious and into the light, it loses its power over you. You can finally make different choices. She began to ask herself a new question. What do I want? Not what would make him proud, not what looks good to others, but what do I genuinely want? And slowly, painstakingly, she began to rebuild her life on a new foundation. not rebellion against her father, not seeking his approval, but simply living from her own authentic desires and values. This is the gift of solitude. It shows you the truth. And yes, the truth can be painful, but it's also liberating. Because you can't change what you can't see, and you can't see what you are constantly running from. Most people live their entire lives without ever seeing themselves clearly. They are too busy, too distracted, too afraid to look. And so they keep repeating the same patterns, making the same mistakes, wondering why their life feels like a hamster wheel, lots of motion but no real progress. But when you commit to being alone with yourself regularly, when you make it a practice to sit in silence and self-reflection, you begin to see the patterns. You begin to understand why you do what you do, why you choose what you choose, why you keep ending up in the same situations despite your best intentions. And with that understanding comes power. Not power over others, but power over yourself. The power to change, to grow, to evolve. The power to break free from unconscious patterns and live with intention and awareness. There's something else that happens when you learn to be alone with yourself. You develop discernment. You become able to distinguish between your authentic voice and the countless other voices competing for your attention. The voice of your culture, your family, your religion, your peers, the media, social conditioning. We're all carrying these voices inside us, often without realizing it. And when we don't take time to be alone, to get quiet enough to hear our own voice, we mistake these other voices for our own. We think we want what advertising tells us we should want. We think we believe what our parents taught us to believe. We think we value what society says we should value. But when you spend time alone, really alone, you begin to hear the difference. You begin to recognize which thoughts are truly yours and which are borrowed. You begin to understand what you genuinely want versus what you've been conditioned to want. I'm reminded of a story about a successful businessman who seemed to have everything: wealth, status, influence. But at 50 years old, he had a crisis. Not a midlife crisis in the cliche sense, but a genuine existential crisis. He realized he had spent 30 years building a life that looked successful from the outside, but felt empty on the inside. So he did something unexpected. He sold his company, much to everyone's shock, and spent a year traveling alone. Not luxury travel, not Instagram-worthy destinations, but simple, quiet travel. Small towns, modest accommodations, long stretches of time with nothing to do and nowhere to be. During that year, he kept a voice recorder with him. Whenever a thought or feeling arose that seemed important, he would record it. No editing, no filtering, just raw, honest reflection. By the end of the year, he had hundreds of hours of recordings. And when he listened back to them, he heard something remarkable. For the first few months, the voice on the recordings didn't even sound like him. It sounded like a composite of his father, his business mentors, the self-help books he'd read, the success philosophies he'd absorbed. But gradually, another voice began to emerge. Quieter at first, tentative, uncertain, but increasingly clear and strong. His own voice. The voice of the boy he'd been before the world told him who he should become. The voice of his authentic self, buried under decades of conditioning and performance. That voice told him things he'd been afraid to hear. It told him he'd never really wanted to run a business. He'd wanted to teach, to mentor, to work with young people. It told him the marriage he'd stayed in for 20 years was built on obligation rather than love. It told him he'd sacrificed his health, his relationships, his joy on the altar of an achievement that ultimately meant nothing to him. These were hard truths, devastating truths in some ways, but they were also liberating truths. Because once he had his authentic voice, once he reconnected with his true self, he could finally start making choices aligned with who he actually was rather than who he thought he should be. He came back from that year of solitude and made radical changes. Not impulsively, not recklessly, but with a clarity and conviction he'd never felt before. And while some people thought he was crazy, while some relationships ended and his life looked very different from the outside, he finally felt alive. For the first time in decades, he felt like he was living his life rather than performing someone else's. This is what I'm inviting you into. Not a year of traveling the world. That's not realistic or necessary for most people. But a commitment to regular solitude, to creating space in your life, to hear your own voice, to know yourself, to live from your truth rather than other people's expectations. Start small if you need to. Maybe it's just 15 minutes a day of sitting in silence. Maybe it's 1 hour a week where you disconnect completely and spend time alone with your thoughts. Maybe it's a monthly solo retreat, just a day where you go somewhere alone, leave your phone behind and do nothing but be present with yourself. Whatever it is, make it non-negotiable. Treat it like the most important appointment of your week, because this is where you develop the self-awareness that will guide every other decision in your life. This is where you cultivate the inner strength that will carry you through life's inevitable storms. This is where you discover who you truly are beneath all the masks and roles and performances. And let me tell you what you'll find when you do this work consistently. You'll find that you're enough. Not because you've achieved enough or accumulated enough or impressed enough people, but because your worth isn't dependent on any of those things. You'll find that the love and validation you've been desperately seeking from others has been inside you all along. You'll find that peace isn't something you need to chase or earn. It's your natural state when you're aligned with your authentic self. You also find courage you didn't know you had. Because when you know yourself, when you're grounded in your own truth, you become less afraid. Not fearless. Fear is a natural human emotion, but less controlled by fear. You can take risks because you're not risking your sense of self. You can face rejection because your worth isn't determined by other people's acceptance. You can pursue your dreams because you are no longer paralyzed by the question of what others would think. The path of learning to be alone with yourself is the path of true maturity. Is the journey from dependence to independence to interdependence. Is the evolution from needing others to define you, to defining yourself, to being so secure in yourself that you can enter into relationships and communities without losing yourself in them. This work never ends. You don't arrive at a destination where you've completely figured yourself out and can now coast. You are a dynamic being, constantly evolving, constantly changing. New layers emerge, new patterns surface, new truths reveal themselves, and that's beautiful. That's part of being alive. But what changes is your relationship with yourself. Instead of being a stranger to yourself, you become your own best friend. Instead of avoiding yourself, you welcome yourself. Instead of judging yourself harshly, you meet yourself with compassion and curiosity. And from that foundation, everything else in your life transforms. Your relationships deepen because you are no longer using them to escape yourself. Your work becomes more meaningful because it's aligned with your authentic values rather than external expectations. Your life becomes an expression of who you truly are rather than a performance for an invisible audience. So I want to leave you with this invitation. Start today. Not tomorrow, not when life calms down, not when you have more time. Today, find 15 minutes of solitude. Turn off your phone, step away from all distractions, and just be with yourself. Don't try to be productive. Don't try to figure anything out. Don't try to be spiritual or enlightened. Just be present with yourself as you are. Notice what comes up. Notice the discomfort, the restlessness, the desire to reach for distraction. Notice it all without judgment. This is the beginning of the journey. This is where transformation starts. In the willingness to finally stop running and face yourself with honesty and courage. You are worth knowing. Your authentic self is worth discovering. The life you're meant to live is waiting on the other side of this journey. But you have to take the first step. You have to be willing to be alone with yourself. And I promise you this, what you find in that solitude isn't something to be afraid of. It's something precious, something powerful, something that's been waiting your entire life to be recognized and embraced. You find yourself. The real you, the you that exists beneath all the noise and conditioning and performance, and that discovery will change everything. The journey of 1,000 miles begins with a single step. Your journey to yourself begins with the willingness to be alone. Take that step today. Your future self will thank you for the courage you showed in this moment.